Welcome. Today on Authors in Conversation, I'm talking to Gideon Rachman, author of The Age of the Strongman, How the Cult of the Leader Threatens Democracy Around the World. Gideon is, of course, Chief Foreign Affairs columnist of the Financial Times. I'm Iain Martin, editor of Reaction. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, hit the subscribe button below. And also, if you do want my weekly newsletter on politics and economics and all that sort of stuff, then you can subscribe via the Reaction website, and you get that and all the other stuff from the Reaction team. Gideon, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
So something's gone wrong here. In the 1990s, politics was dominated by a certain idea of leadership. I would suggest leaders would become more Western. In one sense, dictatorship was being seen off. It was all about the primacy of international institutions and standards. And then something changes and produces what you describe as the age of the strongman. What, in your terms, goes wrong?
Well, I think quite a lot of things go wrong, but maybe it's worth establishing quite how big the shift was, because rather almost too symbolically, Putin, who we're now preoccupied by for obvious reasons, comes to power on the 31st of December 1999, the dawn of this 21st century, when, as you say, we'd convinced ourselves after a decade after the fall of the Berlin Wall that we kind of knew what effective international leadership would look like, and it wouldn't be a dictator, it wouldn't be a strongman leader. And Putin even plays along with that for a while. He is sort of talks about establishing democracy in Russia. That's how he's greeted by Bill Clinton and others as a Democrat. But then you get a run of these leaders. You get Erdogan in Turkey, who comes in 2003, similarly greeted in the West as a modernizer, liberal, but also, like Putin, still in power 20 years later, increasingly dictatorial. Xi Jinping in 2012 in China, who, again, obviously China's never been a democracy, but it had moved after Mao quite deliberately to a more collective style of leadership. For example, establishing term limits for leaders, which Xi has now abolished. 2014, again, in a democracy, you have Narendra Modi coming to power in India. And he too establishes a kind of personality cult. Just to give you a flavor of that, if you get vaccinated in India, the vaccination certificate has Modi's face on it. I mean, there's a real identification of state and leader, which is, I think, a characteristic of strongman politics. Then 2016, obviously the big one, is Trump comes elected. And he too is, strong is his favorite word. We got to be strong. And he's also very personalized. I alone can do it, is what he says to the Republican convention in 2016. It's not about systems, it's about me. And then another run, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, 2017, Bolsonaro in Brazil in 2018, so that by 2018, you can say that the two most populous countries in the world, India and China, have strongman leaders. The most powerful country in the world, the United States, has a strongman leader. Russia as well. The biggest country in Latin America. In fact, the two biggest countries in Latin America, because I'd put AMLO in Mexico in that category. So it's a huge global trend. And as you say, the big question, which I've actually failed to answer, but we'll get on to, I'm sure, is well, why? Why does it happen? And it's hard to have a single monocausal explanation, but there's a bit of economics, there's a bit of technology, there's a bit of social cultural backlash, and I think there's also an emulation effect, so that when Putin comes to power initially, people see him as, say, initially a Democrat, and then as an anomaly. Merkel says he's a 19th century figure struggling in the 21st century. But he accumulates a fan club who include people like Nigel Farage, incidentally, who says, he's the politician he admires most. And indeed, Trump, just before the invasion of Ukraine, says he's a genius. So, there you go.
To what extent do you think it's a backlash to globalization?
I think it is, to a large extent, a backlash against globalization. Although that's, globalization is an amorphous concept, and so the backlash is also a little bit amorphous. But certainly, if you take the West first, I think, well, one way of thinking about the backlash against globalization is to say that in the West, it's a sort of economic backlash against the economics of globalization. And I think in the rising nations, the East, if you like, it's a backlash against the political norms and the cultural norms associated with globalization. So if you take the West first, obviously Trump's whole slogan is America first. and he appeals to a substantial group of people who haven't done well in the sort of 20 years after the 1990s, and American real incomes fall for a lot of for as Trump says, we love the uneducated. It's his voting blog, and for people without degrees, the country deindustrializes and they're doing quite badly, and a very sort of stark sign of that is when the life expectancy for white males without a university degree falls, and the economist Angus Dayton calls them deaths of despair, because so many of them are linked to either suicide or drug addiction and so on. So this is a group that's doing very badly, and that is, for understandable reasons, susceptible to the message that the system is broken, it's rigged against you, and so on. And actually, the voters for Trump in sort of demographic social terms are very similar to, I think, the people who vote for Brexit, who are non-metropolitan, tend to be less likely to have a degree, more likely to come from deindustrialized areas, and so on. So that's the economic bit that I think is very striking in the West. I think in the emerging countries like India, China, Russia, you could put in that category, their leaderships are slightly in revolt against the universalist tendencies of globalization. The argument that, okay, look, there's one way of doing things that will be enforced by a common global rule book, which is both designed and enforced basically in the West, in the US. And they begin to say, no, we represent separate civilizations, as they say it, in Russia, China, and India to some extent. And we're not going to do it your way. And we are increasingly sort of angry by what we regard as Western political and cultural imperialism. And so these leaders are leaders who stress national pride and cultural identity that is different. I mean, some of these arguments are very self-serving, but they resonate, I think, to some extent.
One common feature, I suppose, is the dislike of elites, or the distrust of mainstream media as well. Why does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is to do with this economic discontent, so that there's a group out there who can feel, and I think you say in the West, you could also have the Iraq War and the financial crisis. So you have like three different things: declining living standards, globalization. People say, well, hang on, whose idea was it to, have a free trade agreement with Mexico? It's a much poorer country, for example. And then the Iraq War is a project that the elite are, pretty unified about. Hillary Clinton votes for it, as does, the leadership of the Republican Party. Obviously, it's a war that happens under a Republican administration. And yet these wars go badly wrong. And I was just looking at the statistics, 15,000 Americans were killed in those wars, but then twice that number killed themselves subsequently, having served in those wars. And then you think of the numbers who, may not have committed suicide, but will be absolutely traumatized, hundreds of thousands of wounded. This war has a terrible effect on the United States. And it's not perhaps that surprising that you then have the opioid epidemic, the backlash against Trump, and so on. And it's the backlash in favor of Trump. And it's so, and if you're sitting in Washington or New York, it's not your kids who've served in those wars. So it seems a bit abstract. Yeah. But so I think, and then you have the financial crisis. And again, this seems to be a kind of elite failure, and yet nobody goes to jail. Very few. I don't think anybody from Wall Street went to jail, but the economy is in turmoil. A lot of people get foreclosed on their homes. And I remember actually seeing Steve Bannon. It's not a man I normally hugely sympathize with, but he gave a speech sort of linking populism to the financial crisis, and said that that's really where it all stems from. Anyway,
because the impact, as you described there, on foreclosures, but the impact on the housing market at the bottom end across America. Put that together with the opioid crisis. In a way, it's not a surprise that there was some kind
and the way that people had cushioned themselves against the fall in real wages was by debt. They'd maxed out their credit cards and borrowed, been able to buy a house because mortgages were interest rates are nothing, and you can get mortgages very easily, and then suddenly bang, it blows up in their faces. So
So let's go back to Putin. The book went to print before the Russian attempted invasion of Ukraine. But Putin is at the heart of the story that you're telling, and you describe him it's the first chapter as the archetype. Two parts to this question: what did or does he want? I mean, first, what did he set out to do? It's obviously gone wrong in Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, in Ukraine, what does he want? I mean, I think that the story of Putin. I mean, obviously, a lot of us are asking, have we misread him? So any interpretation, you're kind of sort of backfitting on what's now happened. But I think that from about 2005, he's increasingly anti-Western, and personally, I trace it to the so-called color revolutions that take place in some of the post-Soviet states, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, and so on, Ukraine, most obviously. Which he, being a KGB ex-operative, sees as the product of Western intelligence, nefarious, sort of dabbling in their politics. He doesn't accept that these are kind of spontaneous uprisings, and suddenly decides, okay, the West is out to get me. That the West is intent on regime change, even in Russia, to create a more West-friendly regime, and this becomes a consistent theme of his. And in 2012, I happened to be in Moscow when there were Putin announces he's going to come back as president. And there were huge demonstrations against that in Moscow. And as I said, I was there. And I remember seeing people carrying a banner saying Putin equals Gaddafi. Gaddafi had just been shot and killed, and after Western intervention. And I think that sort of hardens Putin's paranoia. And then you get another uprising in Ukraine in 2014. The Ukrainians want to join or have an association agreement with the EU. The Russians intervene to stop that. And then that leads to the annexation of Crimea and steadily worsening relations. But I think behind this sort of paranoia about the West's intent to attack him, he increasingly associates himself with the Russian state, which is a classic sort of strongman leader. He doesn't disentangle me personally and my fate from the fate of the nation. And I think he also begins to become increasingly convinced by a narrative of Western weakness. So that in 2013, Obama famously draws a red line in Syria and doesn't enforce it. And then in 2015, Putin goes into Syria and seems to do quite well there. And it looks like, Russia can represent this decisive model of leadership while the West is kind of fumbling around.
And Putin and Obama in that period is also pretty disparaging.
Absolutely. Obama makes a number of arguably mistakes with Putin. First of all, he attempts this reset, so that I think, if there's a tendency for American presidencies maybe to do just the opposite of what the others have done. So he decides that, that Bush has let relations with Russia go wrong. And then even despite the invasion of Georgia, which takes place during the 2008 presidential campaign, he still attempts to reset relations with Russia. In other words, to put things to one side.
He warns Romney, doesn't he? He's very almost dismissive of Romney during the presidential debate.
Says that Russia is the biggest threat to world peace, and Obama laughs at him and says, what century are you living in? They've really written Russia off, and that comes in a famous remark where Obama says, they're just a regional power, and that is poison to the Russians, who are addicted to this idea of themselves as a great power. And I remember during the research of the book and just in my general work for the FT, meeting a smart guy called Fyodor Lukyanov, who's a kind of leading Russian foreign policy analyst who is quite close to Putin. He interviews him on stage every year at the Valdai Forum. And I said to him, what's driving Putin? And he said, he is worried that for the first time in centuries, Russia will lose its status as a great power, as one of the world's leading powers, and that's what he is in revolt against. Now, some of Putin's enemies would say that's all just hypocrisy. Basically, what Putin is about is stealing money and allowing people around him to steal money. And as some Russian friend have put to me, the only thing that really upsets him or would upset him is if you got between him and the cash machine. But I mean, I think oddly, he can be simultaneously sort of cynical enough to allow theft and to enrich himself, and a patriot. I don't think he's putting on his Russian nationalism, and maybe a kind of link, maybe getting overly psychological, but is a sort of corrosive cynicism. I think they're very cynical about people's motivations and so on. So, everybody steals, don't they? That's just what you do, or you enrich yourself if you're running a country. Everybody does that. Come on. And then similarly, I think his whole narrative about the West at the beginning of the Ukraine war, he talks about the West as the empire of lies. And he's very, he returns again and again to this idea of Western hypocrisy. And there's plenty of it to point to, that he will say, well, hang on, you're saying I can't intervene in Ukraine, but you intervened in Iraq. Mm. You're saying you're against regime change, but what did you do in Libya? He's very adept at that kind of stuff. And I think it does gnaw at him. And so he thinks, well, you did Kosovo, so why can't I do the countries near me? So that's their kind of argument.
What's your assessment of the situation now and where it's likely to lead? How much trouble is he in? Is he losing, having expected a relatively easy victory in Ukraine? He's been denied that, but it would be unlike the Russians to just give up. So what's the prognosis?
It's obviously hard to say. It's evolving, but I think what we do know is that it's gone much, much worse for him than he could have imagined. I mean, I think that they thought they would stroll in 3 days, and just take Kiev. Probably based because after Crimea, there's a sort of film of Putin exulting almost in disbelief and saying, we took it without firing a shot. And I think he concluded from that Ukraine was a house of cards and just push it and would fall over. And obviously that was not the case. And now it's a bit of a disaster. I mean, they've lost one can't be sure how many, but it's say between 12 and 25,000 people. And that's, even if it's the lower estimate, that's more people killed in 6 weeks than they lost in a decade in Afghanistan. And we were talking about, the effects of those kinds of losses on the United States. Presumably they'll be similar in Russia. But as you say, he can't really give up. So he's going to keep plugging. The question is whether, his military is now so degraded that they can't even achieve the limited aims that they've set for themselves of taking Donbass and Luhansk, which, they pull back from Kiev. And then if he's faced with a real humiliation, what does he do then? Which brings in the fear of nuclear escalation, which, again, I don't think that it's likely, but it's possible. And, a possibility like that is so appalling that people have to take it seriously.
And what happens to Ukraine in those circumstances? The Ukrainians have fought incredibly bravely and been ingenious throughout. But even if you get to some kind of frozen conflict with him still in parts of the Donbass, an ungovernable space has been created, hasn't it? And also Ukraine then finds itself really with cities in ruins, infrastructure badly damaged. It seems to be there. I've seen estimates saying that the Ukrainian GDP is down 40% this year so far. We'll see what the eventual figure is, which is more obviously a bigger impact in the war zone than the impact on the Russian economy. And Ukraine is then going to have to become de facto a protectorate, isn't it, of the West, very heavily armed with huge amounts of infrastructure investment and a very difficult space in terms of intelligence gathering and security.
Yeah, no, and the other thing, everything you say is true. Add to that the fact that the Russians are blockading the Black Sea, so they can't export either. They're one of the world's leading grain producers, and they can't get the grain out. And taking it by rail is just, very, very difficult. Ukraine is in big trouble. And I think that there's certainly a risk of Western triumphalism, that we're so focused on Russia's losses that we don't see that Ukraine, as you point out, their economy shrunk by 3 times the fact that Russia's economy has shrunk. Their losses. You'll notice there's not much discussion of Ukrainian casualty figures. It's a kind of don't ask, don't tell, but they'll be high.
It seems to. It might be as high as 25,000 so far, and maybe even
a lot of people. And so yes, it's a society and an economy in ruins. And I think their fear must be um, and Putin's hope that at some point the West loses interest or becomes very focused on its own economic problems, because we're going to get, we are already getting a backlash. Had problems with inflation beforehand, but now this puts another ratchet on energy prices, on food prices. And at what point will the politicians in the West saying, okay, it's enough,
Yeah.
come to the fore? And so I think, if Putin can hang on long enough, maybe Donald Trump will reemerge as president, or the Trump faction in the Republican Party will become dominant. At the moment, they're not. I mean, at the moment, the default Republican position is more hawkish than Biden, and to accuse Biden of weakness, etc. But obviously, they could pivot very quickly with a different set of leaders to the more Tucker Carlson line of saying,
Yeah.
this isn't our fight. It's sort of democratic evangelism. It's the kind of logic that got us into Iraq and Afghanistan. It's a long way away. Let's pull out. And then the burden then falls on the Europeans. And are they going to push it for that long? And the splits within the EU will emerge, with Germany beginning to say, as say the head of VW said just recently, well, come on, let's try and get back to normal relations with Russia. And the Poles and the Balts saying absolutely not. And the Spanish and the Italians, feeling it's rather a long way away. They don't have the direct sense of threat that the Easterners have. So I'm not saying all of this will happen, but there is a chance that the Western response will get weaker.
But the split that you described there, I mean, that only seems to be getting worse when you see the comments coming out of the Baltic nations about Germany. Descriptions of trust being almost at zero.
Yeah.
Plus, look at how Sweden and Finland, joining NATO, but also allying very closely with
the
the UK and the Polish connection, countries like Romania. Can all of that somehow cohere, do you think, into some sort of common
I
European
hope so.
response?
I mean, I think that, because I think at the moment, obviously there are these differences in emphasis, and these countries weren't getting on that well beforehand, because Poland and Hungary were being sort of sanctioned by the Commission for violating democracy or rule of law and so on. But there is a common threat, and although it is the case that the Germans are sort of prevaricating a bit and making, Scholz is obviously just not at home in a chancellor yet. I mean, he was a little bit unlucky, perhaps, that the war breaks up 10 days after he comes in. Maybe it's not a coincidence. I mean, admittedly, it's CDU loyalists saying this to me, but they said, that Putin may have timed it for 10 days after Merkel stepped down, because Germany is, even if she was quite sort of friendly to Russia at times, she'd been around a long time. She was a kind of, she might have helped pull the EU together, where Scholz has sort of disappeared. But, even by those standards, Germany has announced big increases in defense spending. And the signal that the German government might have got from the recent election, they've just done very badly in North Rhine-Westphalia elections, is that their German people are not impressed by their handling of Ukraine. And the more hawkish voices, the CDU and oddly the Greens, have done well in the election. So that might send a signal to the Germans to toughen up a bit.
Now, back to your book, we're discussing The Age of the Strongman, how the cult of the leader threatens democracy around the world, with the author Gideon Rachman on Authors in Conversation on Reaction. On China, the China story also turns out not quite as expected. And you describe your trips there and the closing down of debate in recent years. Why did we in the West get this call wrong, do you think, on China?
I think that we were, like, as with a lot of countries, our end of history phase lasted quite a long time, that there was this surge in Western self-confidence after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and a sense that, we actually had the answers and other people would have to learn from us. And that the playbook was that the reason the Soviet Empire had collapsed was because they weren't democratic. And if you weren't democratic, you couldn't really have a functioning economy, because there was a connection between economic freedom and political freedom. And we projected that onto China. So we had a kind of almost deterministic view of what would happen there. The argument being that at some point they would have to make a choice between economic growth and political and dictatorship, because if they continued being a dictatorship, obviously the economy would fail, and therefore they would yield to democracy. And so we tend to sort of impose that view on that sort of inevitabilist view on them.
Yeah.
And so when Xi comes to power in 2012, he's a younger guy. He does talk a lot about economic reform. And I remember actually I was at a meeting in Beijing in 2013. I sort of managed to sneak into a meeting which was mainly kind of ex-political leaders and grandees and so on. And I remember Gordon Brown was there. And he's always obsessed by economic reform. And he was saying, he was fascinated by what she was saying about economics. He saw it purely as a kind of economic thing. He's going to do this, he's going to do that. He'll, denationalize, et cetera, et cetera. The politics of what she was about were really kind of, and to be fair, when she spoke to us, that's all he spoke about was economic reform. He wasn't presenting his other stuff. And to the extent his political stuff, he was talking about, anti-corruption drives, which sound fine, that sounds good, doesn't it? But in fact, he arrests over 1 million people in that, which is a sign of how authoritarian he was going to be. And it wasn't just, a bunch of columnists, not me actually in this occasion, write that, he will obviously move towards a more liberal, politically liberal China, starting with the independence of the courts, etc. So it was a sort of us imposing our view of what he should do on him. And then it becomes apparent over the next, by 2017, he is abolishing term limits, incorporating his thought into the constitution. And I think also a turning point in foreign policy terms is 2014, when it becomes clear that China's building military bases across the South China Sea. And that's a huge challenge to the US. And actually, when you think about it, 2014 is an interesting year. So 2013, the red line is not enforced in Syria. 2014, annexation of Crimea, and China builds these military bases across the South China Sea. So yeah, I think that's sort of when geopolitical conflict begins to spiral up, and it is connected, I think, with the increasingly authoritarian tone at home.
And Fukuyama describes it, Francis Fukuyama describes it as China having been totalitarian under Mao, though of course the technology doesn't exist. He still does a lot of damage, but he is properly totalitarian. China then moves into an authoritarian phase, which we misinterpret. We think is a step on the road towards something like liberalism. And then actually what he represents in 2012 is a shift back steadily to totalitarianism with the technology available this time to actually
and we also misinterpret the technology, because we think, if you remember, the early phase of the internet is whoopee, this is liberation, information is now unstoppable, etc., etc. And I think an early sign of where China's going is actually even before he takes power, is in 2008-9, when they say they start constructing the Great Firewall of China, and they boot Google search out, they boot Facebook out, they say, you know what, we're not having this. And now China is probably the biggest surveillance society in the world. And because nobody can exist without a mobile phone, increasingly in the West, but definitely in China, where everything is mobile payments with your phones and so on, they know where you are at all times, if they want to.
Do you think it's going to flip back in terms of the geopolitics of this? In Europe, it's happening on our doorstep, the Ukrainian conflict. We're obsessed by Ukraine, and I think will continue to be. But in the US, the focus seems to be, and has been for a long time, is almost a bipartisan view on China. China is seen as a bigger story, I would suggest. Reading the American press, haven't been back for a while. But actually the coming story is the building of that conflict between the US and China. Though maybe China have learned some lessons from the Russian disaster.
We'll see. Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be one of the big questions: is what conclusions does China draw from the Russian disaster? Because in fact, on February the 4th, I think just 20 days before the invasion of Russia, Xi has a big meeting with Putin in Beijing, and they issue a joint Chinese-Russian statement, which is long and quite broad in scope. I mean, it's really an attack on American global leadership, and announce a partnership without limits, as they call it. And then, maybe historians will discover how much Putin actually told Xi about what he was intending to do. The Chinese are now saying he didn't tell us, that he was about to invade. But clearly, I think it's uncomfortable for China now. I think if Putin had won a quick and easy victory, that would have been great for China, because it would have fitted the narrative of declining American power, which is one Xi has been pumping out, and which was after the disaster of Afghanistan, or the Afghan withdrawal anyway. If 6 months later, Ukraine had been rolled over with America doing nothing, perfect. But actually the opposite has happened, and now they've got a whole set of awkward choices about how closely they stick to the Russians, and what are their implications for their own often expressed desire to invade Taiwan, or to bring back Taiwan, even if that means invasion. So yeah, they're in slight trouble. And I think the other thing that's interesting is that, I ended the book by saying, slightly optimistically maybe, look, strongman rule won't last because it's a flawed model. It's if you centralize power around a single individual, it's a recipe for them eventually making a catastrophic error that you can't correct, because there are no checks and balances. There's no way of getting the person out of power. And we've seen that happen then, like a couple of months after the book was finished, that happened with Russia. And I think it's happening with China now. I mean, I think that the lockdown in Shanghai is very undercovered because there's nobody there. I mean, there are one or two unfortunate Western journalists who are sort of, tweeting from their confinement. But basically, this is a city that's 25 million people have essentially been imprisoned for 6 weeks. With the possibility that this will spread to Beijing and so on, it's a real mess. And some massive infringements on liberty, big disaster for the Chinese economy, and at a very, very awkward time, because, I mentioned that Xi abolished term limits. Well, in November, there's a big party congress where he is due to be reappointed for a third term as party general secretary. And what everyone was saying up until now was he really needs a period of peace and calm and so on to create this inevitability and sense that obviously this is the thing to do. And, in fact, he's created the opposite. And I think partly because one of the characteristics of this strongman style is to associate everything good with yourself. So when China said zero COVID was like a huge success, they would say it proved the superiority of the Chinese system, and it specifically proved the wisdom of Xi Jinping's leadership. And now, what do you say? So they're just kind of ignoring the fact that it's gone horribly wrong.
Just to touch on India.
Yeah.
You present in the Age of the Strongman, present Modi as such an interesting and significant character. In the West, the hope was or is that India would be a bulwark against China, but you say that that's naive.
Well, no, I mean, I think it's naive to regard them as a democratic bulwark, as a sort of alliance of values. I mean, obviously, they're much more democratic than China. So in that sense, it makes sense. I think geostrategically, yes, India's increasingly with us because they're scared of China, because, the Chinese killed some Indian troops, actually, was it 2021? And so they pivoted to a sort of alliance with the West. The Quad with Australia and Japan and the US is a real thing. But I think that, and it's interesting, actually, last time I was in Washington talking to people in the administration, they kind of spontaneously brought up their concern about Indian democracy, something which would drive the Indians wild. But they, there is an increasingly assertive majoritarianism there, which is leading to sort of bubbling communal violence and concerns about the position of Muslims there, but also sort of trademark strongman things, which is a increasing pressure on the press, increasing pressure on the courts. And I was talking to an Indian journalist friend who is currently in the United States and is sort of wondering whether to go back to India. And I said, do you think you'll be safe? This was just a couple of weeks ago. And he said, well, the government told me we've written scripts on all of you liberals. We're just waiting to put them into production. So, that's the kind of, and similarly, it's a hard thing to put your finger on. But for example, Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winner, etc., now based at Harvard, he gave an interview to the New Yorker where he said, look, when I ring up my friends in India now, I can hear they're frightened to talk to me on the phone, because the phones are tapped and people are worried about pressure being put to them on the government. And that tells you something. That's kind of new in India. You had the emergency period under Gandhi, but Indira Gandhi, but basically, you did have freedom of speech, a fairly chaotic democracy, and I think yes, they have elections. Yes, Modi can lose them, but it's the space for dissent is narrowing, I think.
Yeah. Just on Britain and Boris Johnson, does Boris Johnson really fit in this story, especially after what's happened with the war in Ukraine, where to a certain extent the Brits and the US, certainly British and US intelligence is pretty much vindicated, and the UK's been was relatively quick to aid Ukraine. Does Boris really fit?
Well, I sort of struggled with this, and I thought, should I put him in the book? Shouldn't I? And the reason I put him in was partly actually for pragmatic reasons. I thought, okay, this book's coming out in Britain. People will be interested to read about where he fits into it. So, and I think he does at the margins. Yes, he does. I would say for a couple of reasons. The first is that certainly talking to people outside the UK, they very much linked Trump and Brexit back in 2016. There was almost like a single phrase, Trump and Brexit, as part of what we were talking about earlier, this sort of anti-elite backlash, anti-globalist backlash. And Trump himself makes the connection. I mean, oddly, I hadn't realized, but he was in the UK when the vote took place. He was playing golf up in Scotland at one of his courses. And he said, yeah, this shows we'll win in November. And Bannon actually said to me once, the moment I knew we would win was when Britain voted for Brexit, because they saw the coalitions of voters as similar. That said, I think the British politician that Trump really liked and identified with was not Johnson, but Farage. I mean, it's Farage who was the first guy in to see him, in Trump Tower afterwards. But then, obviously, everyone in Britain's preoccupied by American politics and what lessons we can learn from that. And I think Boris draws a few lessons from Trump, and particularly when he resigns, in the period when he's resigned from the May government, he starts talking about Trump as a potential model for the way to deal with the EU. Says, we've been sort of good boys and goody-goodies, played by the rules. We really need to go in there and break the furniture a bit. And he does try that a little bit. It's actually more in the UK, with the prorogation of Parliament, and then again, it's an interesting one because prorogation of Parliament is a very radical thing to do, but then he gets overruled by the courts. And I think if Trump would have said, well, I'm not taking that, I don't accept the court's verdict, they're bent, whatever. Johnson, to his credit, doesn't do that. But I think there is there are sort of strongman elements of it. You can see it even in Dominic Cummings' stuff about, let's not take this bullshit legal advice. That's a very sort of classic sort of strongman thing, the law, who cares about that? Let's just get it done. And I think that some of the populism, the kind of 3-word slogan, make America great again, take back control, these are similar things. But yeah, he's at the margins. I think you could argue it either way.
I mean, on the proroguing Parliament thing, I mean, it was an example, wasn't it, of Cummings and Boris Johnson essentially trying to drive, and this was the Cummings approach, worked in the end actually, to try and drive opponents mad, so that they didn't think clearly. And of course, what they wanted throughout, because the only thing that gave them any freedom of maneuver was then having a majority, which they couldn't get without an election. Yeah. So they wanted to just sort of clog up the brains of their opponents until eventually
to give them that election. Cummings is not as much of a genius as he thinks he is, but I think he has a certain political astuteness. And I think he had that sort of, I mean, he's an odd guy because as far as I know, he's not a Trump fan, but he has some of the sort of Bannon-like contempt for, the Washington/SW1 insider, and this sense that he has a kind of feel for the country out there and they don't, which is a sort of populist formula.
I think he's in my various encounters with him down the years, because he is, calmer and more thoughtful in person. Mind you, that wouldn't be hard, but that he is highly intelligent. I've always thought of him very much as a frustrated journalist, which he would absolutely hate. I can't tell you how much he would hate the idea that he really wanted to be a journalist. But of course, he did have a spell, running the Spectator website, which
I'd say
came to an end. So he's prone to these. I mean, we recognise it as columnists, is that sometimes sort of making a bold declaration. It's almost as though he's writing in headlines and trying to get attention. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, totally. And I sometimes feel that the people that he describes as the people he despises are quite an accurate description of himself. You know, the Oxbridge arts graduate who's a sort of crazed generalist. You know, okay, he's taught himself maths, so he can do maths A level, but essentially he is the thing that he says is sort of wrong with Britain. It's kind of ironic.
So then we talked about Trump earlier, but just a quick question on Trump then. We just talked about how it happened, what he represented. Is he coming back, do you think?
I think so. Yeah, I do. I mean, it's obviously it's 2.5 years out. Who knows what could happen? But Biden's ratings are in the tank. Kamala Harris is just not taking off. Inflation is going to be political poison in America, as it always is. The Republicans will somehow spin Ukraine as a consequence of Biden's weakness. The line will be, you know, it would never have happened if we'd had Trump in power. And the Republican Party is set up to win. The question is, does Trump still control it? We'll learn a little bit more in the next few weeks, actually, because of the Republican primaries and so on. But so far, Trump-endorsed candidates are doing well. J.D. Vance won in Ohio. And it does suggest that Trump still has a grip on the party. So if he runs, I think he'll get the nomination. If he gets the nomination, I think he'll win. So, you know, people don't want to believe it because it's shocking all round. But I suspect he'll win.
Because it's unclear, isn't it, who the Democrats have to run? Because maybe Biden will actually try and run again, but it
He
seems
would be
unlikely.
82, though.
I know. So they can't run Biden, I would suggest. They can't run Harris. Beyond that?
Yeah, well, I mean, and
No, it's early.
what's that?
It is early. It is early. It's early in the state.
I mean, so some people are, you know, Biden is still okay, and I don't actually buy the idea that he's senile, but you know, he could run again at the age of 82. But alternatively, he might step down or announce a year early, kind of Lyndon Johnson style, that he's not going to run again, and give time for a field that's other than Harris, so that Harris either proves herself by running and winning, or somebody else reemerges. But I think that the other thing is there's a huge split in the Democrats between the progressives and the sort of Biden wing, you know, the AOC wing and the Biden wing. And the Biden people, I was just in Washington last week, are privately coruscating about the progressives and how damaging they are to the party. And I think their fear is if Biden stepped aside, somebody from the left of the party might get the nomination, simply because it's the activists who vote and organize, whether it would be AOC herself or a figure like that. And then you know, Trump's in even better shape.
Yep. Now, then, just a couple of final questions. Merkel and Macron, they're depicted, you depict them as fighting a battle against the rise of the European strongman. First on Merkel, the legacy's now in ruins, isn't it?
I think ruins is a bit strong. I mean, I think that particularly the stuff on Russia looks worse now than it did before. But Nord Stream 2 wasn't her thing. It was an SPD thing. But obviously she didn't knock it on the head, and German business was very behind it. And she kept doors open to Putin. But that wasn't such a controversial thing in the West at the time. I mean, as we were saying, Obama did the same. And, you know, at times she could be tough with him. I mean, I remember being in Berlin one summer in July, and Navalny, after being poisoned, was flown to Berlin to be treated in a hospital there. So she wasn't a total patsy, but yeah, she put a bet on integrating Russia. Similarly, she was soft on China, but was that different from what David Cameron was doing? You know, it was the same thing. It was business-led policies.
True.
But I think for the rest, you know, those 15 years that she was in power, pretty good years for Germany. And the EU could have fallen apart because of the Greek debt crisis, and one way or another, she kept it together. So I think that people are certainly correctly taking a second look at some of and saying, you know, this sort of Saint Angela stuff, who never put a foot wrong, clearly not the case. But I don't think, you know, I think by the standards of political leaders who've been in power a long time, she still looks okay. I mean, Macron, I think the next 5 years will tell. This really is his chance, because, as we were saying, the new German chancellor's made no impression. Draghi has some leadership skills, but is leading Italy and is, not in a position to lead Europe. So this is Macron's chance to try to push forward his vision for Europe, but it's going to be very, very difficult. And I think that he may have another backlash in France. I don't think people voted for him out of love this time. And they've had the Gilets jaunes in France. He might have more street protests. So what his legacy will be, one can't be sure. But I think that he has some qualities. He's smart. He's energetic. He does have a vision. He's also arrogant and all of that. No doubt about it. He's got some flaws as well. But I think he's got a chance. And certainly in a period when you have these hyper populist leaders around the place, I kind of rather like his self-conscious intellectualism.
Do you think will he get the EU reform that he's looking for?
Look, he hasn't done so badly. Initially the first 3 years, he'd made this big bet. He was going to get the Germans to get behind common European debt and all of that, and it fell very flat. And relations between Paris and Berlin were terrible in the mid sort of Merkel-Macron eras, with both sides feeling sore with each other. And then because of the COVID crisis, it sort of was a bit like that old cliche that they always say in Brussels, the EU only advances in crisis. At that point, Merkel did a sort of 180 and said, okay, we'll have common European debt. And okay, it's an issue limited to fighting COVID and so on. But I think the French feel probably correctly that the principle has been established and that there will be further issuance of common European debt. And now the Germans have done another 180 on defense, or at least on defense spending. And so I think you may get at least the capabilities for European strategic autonomy, which is what one of these things that Macron talks about, which again, I think we in Britain have always been very suspicious of that idea, seen as French folie de grandeur, that they're not going to get anywhere with it. But Britain's no longer there to stop it. And I think that with the prospect of Trump coming back, there's actually more of an argument for the Europeans doing more of their own defense, because there must be a question mark over the future of NATO in the long term, given that sort of Trumpian instinct in the United States. Now, whether Europe gets its act together in time, I think is questionable. The ideas are there, the movement is roughly in the right direction, but Europe moves over the course of a generation, and they may not have a generation.
Yeah, but the Swedes and the Finns and the Balts and the Poles are not. It's unlikely, isn't it, that they see themselves at some point in the next 5 years being led in a Macron-style direction. I mean, I take the point about the US. That is the big question mark hovering over European politics, isn't it? Just if you get a Trump second presidency, what does it mean? Does it mean that Europe has to go straight away for complete strategic autonomy, or is it a bit like last time, where actually the permanent architecture, intelligence, defense spending, deployment, stays roughly the same, with a lot of his rhetoric really just sort of,
totally. That is a huge question. And I mean, I think the gloomy view would be that he would pick up where he left off. And that, in the first administration, he had a lot of establishment types, and McMaster, even John Bolton, who were, Atlanticists, and who would just kind of roll their eyes and not follow through on this stuff. But in the second term, he would start with somebody like Rick Grenell, the former ambassador to Berlin, who's a real Trumpist, as Secretary of State. And they would really stick it to the Europeans and to NATO from the beginning. But then, you talk to some ex-NATO people like George Robertson or whatever, they'll say, look, America will never give this up because it's like a huge tool for them. That they have this 27-member alliance, which is a force magnifier. So why would they give it up? I mean, that's almost, I'm not sure they're that rational, but you're right. It's not written it's not written that Trump will win, and it's not written what he'll do. But I think it would be a mistake to write it off. And I think that, in terms of the Nordics and so on, they have to ask themselves, who do we trust less, the French or the Americans? And at the moment, it's probably the French, because the French have their own motives. Also, they just aren't the military power of the United States. They're not remotely close to being a substitute. So, for historical reasons and practical reasons, you would look to the US for your security guarantee. But if the Balts must have noticed that Trump put huge pressure on Zelensky when that was what the first impeachment was about, him refusing to deliver arms to Ukraine, that he's called Putin a genius, etc., etc. So, their choices are not great ones at the moment.
And then that great irony that the two countries in Europe that are closest in terms of day-to-day defense cooperation and the treaties, France and Britain. Although the public politics doesn't, it's easy to forget that. Just and also on the US, I just wonder there, raise a thought there. If the Democrats can get someone not from the progressive wing, if they can find a solution to the problem which you identified very, very well earlier on, is it an election where you maybe get a mainstream Republican third candidate just to try and stop Trump? Just sort of kind of reverse Perot.
You mean that sort of John Anderson or whoever? A long time ago. I mean that would split the vote, wouldn't it? But it's possible that somebody like Liz Cheney would run, I suppose, and say, "Look, I'm not prepared to put up with this." How successful they'd be, I don't know, and whether they would actually take votes from the Democrat rather than from Trump, because is also possible.
Yes, long history of it going wrong in American politics when it's attempted. Just final question, just really on this. You think the age of the strongman it may almost have peaked? I think just a quote from the book: "History often has been more cyclical than linear. Political trends have risen and fallen. Past precedents suggest that the age of the strongman will also come to an end at some point, but it could last as long as 30 years."
Yeah, so then that gets to the question of, well, when did it begin? If we're going to be optimistic and date it from the beginning of Putin, then we're 22 years in, and it doesn't have to be 30; it could be 26. So maybe we are coming to an end, and that the reason I argued that, and I didn't make it too much of a point in the book because it's not something you can prove scientifically; it's a kind of journalistic observation. But I think you have had these 30-year cycles, so you could say 45, certainly in Western political terms, 45 to 75, the post-war period, expansion of the state, welfare state, the sort of French called the 30 glorious years. And then you have the Thatcher-Reagan backlash, what comes to be called neoliberalism, if you like that term. And that goes from maybe 75 or 79 to 2008, when you have the financial crisis in the sense that something else needs happening. And I think one of the reasons that may happen is you get these ideological movements gather force, they gather confidence, they maybe go too far, and then there's a sort of backlash. Their inherent contradictions come to the fore. So maybe that'll happen with the strongman era, that the sort of, we was talking about how eventually they go wrong, and I think you can see that in Russia and China, and perhaps you will see it with their sort of some of their imitators in democracies. I mean, Erdogan in Turkey is in big trouble. Inflation's rampant, etc., etc. But as you say, it's never not likely to be that clear cut, because if Trump comes back in again, well, there's more of it to come.
Well, Gideon Rachman, thank you very much for joining us. That was so interesting. There's so much in the book that we didn't get to talk about as well, but thank you very much for that today. You've been watching Authors in Conversation on Reaction with me, Iain Martin. If you're not a subscriber on YouTube, just hit the subscribe button below. Until next time, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Iain.